Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Mischa Geracoulis, Outreach and Engagement Officer at Project Censored, contributor to Project Censored's State of the Free Press yearbook series, and author of Media Framing and the Destruction of Cultural Heritage, published by Routledge in 2025. During our conversation, Mischa discussed the origins of her interest in human rights issues and human rights education, how growing up as an Armenian American and hearing stories about the Armenian genocide has influenced her work as a journalist and her work on cultural heritage, the importance of preserving cultural heritage as a human rights issue, the significance of increasing media attention to microhistories when studying 20th century history, how human rights education can become a central focus in the training of journalists and media professionals, relationships between her work at Project Censored and contemporary threats to freedom of expression, particularly censorship, recommendations for how international organizations, NGOs, and other institutions can address the ongoing destruction of cultural heritage, the individuals who have inspired her human rights work, a key quote that sums up her view of the importance of human rights, and a strategic recommendation to advance human rights education for contemporary media professionals. Well, it's such a great pleasure to be speaking with Mischa Geracoulis today, a journalist, human rights advocate, and leading member of Project Censored. How are you today, Mischa?
I'm doing well, Bill, and this is my absolute pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for making this time.
It's our pleasure. So tell us how you first became interested in human rights issues and subsequently in human rights education.
I can't remember a time that I wasn't aware of injustices and marginalization, even if I didn't have those words to put around it. I imagine it was college where I was first introduced to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and acquired a whole vocabulary and framework for engaging in discussion. I remember in college, especially, I started to realize that if someone who was born into a family and acutely aware of displacement, discrimination, and genocide, if I only had anecdotal information about these issues, how little others without any background must know. And I remember asking professors why we, students and citizens in the United States, weren't taught about human rights in our primary education. And of course, there was never any cogent answer, which points to the continued need for human rights education and my interest in pursuing that.
So you have not only discussed it in your book, but in other venues, your experience of being an Armenian American who has heard many stories about the impact of the Armenian genocide. How has that influenced your work as a journalist, and particularly your interest in what you are discussing now in some detail in your new wonderful book, Cultural Heritage Issues?
That's such a thoughtful question, and I really appreciate that. I remember being a very small child. I spent a lot of time with my Armenian grandfather, and I can remember him telling me that he came from a land of rocks and sand, a place that had no name. And that really confused me. And I would ask, what do you mean no name? Every place has a name. And he said the name had been stripped away by occupiers. Well, of course, at the time, I didn't understand what any of that meant, but I somehow grasped the importance of history of knowing history and of calling something and someone by their rightful name. Later in life, when I learned about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, I learned that Article 27 asserts cultural heritage as an extension of the rights of all people, because heritage represents our unique diversity and contributes to our shared humanity. Relating that to matters of genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, cultural heritage is frequently a target for destruction as a means of erasure. And that destruction then paves the way for rewriting of history, which speaks to the importance of accurate documentation. Connecting that to journalism, there's a quote that I love by an Italian journalist and self-described agitator named Oriana Fallaci. She said, "A journalist is a soldier of truth, a witness of history, a spy of the human condition." And to me, I think of that a lot when I first read it in her book some years ago. To me, that captures the power that journalists possess to mark the historical record and impact public memory.
I'd like to take that a little further because one of the things you discuss in your book is the systematic effort by the government of Turkey and its allies in some ways to erase the history of Armenians. And I think one of the things that comes out to me, particularly in that section of your book, is how there's been such a paltry effort over the decades to try and correct the record on this. Can you talk about that?
And there's so many layers to that. You know, there's a qualitative difference. I'm going to come at this, I guess, from a journalistic perspective. There's a qualitative difference in reporting for content versus reporting for impact. And the end goal of content reporting is widespread publication, oftentimes agenda setting. It's one-way communication. It's also, I mean, it has its purpose. It highlights problems which we need to be aware of. In when the Armenian genocide was happening, from about 1890 to 1922, the Western press, the New York Times in particular, known as the paper of record, was covering the decimation of the Armenians by the Ottoman Turks. In the year 1915 alone, the Times had published, I think it was 145 articles, running pieces every couple of days on the massacres and deportations, and consistently describing them as systematic race extermination. By 1923, 1.5 million indigenous Armenians had been killed. I mean, that was news. And then the coverage just stopped. The media moved on, and the Armenian case fell from public consciousness. The Armenian genocide is not taught in American public schools, which may or may not reflect the relationship that the U.S. has with its NATO ally, Turkey, and that Turkey fervently denies the genocide. I think this speaks to military alliances and geopolitical agendas and who controls the narrative. It's,
Yeah, and interestingly enough, excuse me, interestingly enough, here in New Jersey, one of the things that happened when the mandate bill for study of Holocaust and genocides was being considered in the legislature, they actually specifically identified genocides, and one of them was the Armenian genocide. One of the leaders of the legislature at that time was an Armenian, Garabet Haitayan. And what's interesting is that when they put that bill into committee, the Turkish lobby arrived and resisted it very vociferously. So at the end of the day, the law was passed, but without naming anything other than the Holocaust. But yours truly always taught about the Armenian genocide. And I think there are teachers all over the country doing it, but it's not systematic, you might say. And I think that's a terrible thing. I'd like to move on, though, to another issue that you raise in the book. You discuss these connections between the media, human rights, and humanitarianism, and that the issue of destruction of cultural heritage is a central concept and is an example of this. So can you explain how you sort of conceptualize those connections, why the issue of maintaining cultural heritage is so critical for human rights?
I need to first give credit to the editors of Routledge's focus book series on media and humanitarian action. That's Robin Anderson at Fordham University and Pernaka de Silva at Seton Hall. They conceived of those connections, realizing that the way media cover conflict influences our responses to conflict and crises, our being the public, our leaders, and policymakers. To protect cultural heritage as a human right is to stake claim on planet Earth, wherever that place on the planet is. Cultural heritage provides proof of existence, which factors into such things as land rights, the right to speak a mother tongue, or to practice a particular faith, and even to sovereignty and nationhood.
So to pick up on that a little further, you discuss in the book Rafael Lemkin in some detail and how he really felt that cultural heritage was at the center of his discussion and eventually his argument on behalf of creating a genocide convention. Can you establish those connections a little more precisely?
When he was a young person in law school, he was becoming aware of what was happening in Turkey to the Armenians, and it deeply affected him. So he was studying law and realizing that a person, an individual person, can be held accountable for a crime, murder, for example, but a country, a government, would not be held to account in the same way as an individual. And for him, it was stunning. And so that was his start with looking into what he would later call genocide. And he also realized in his deep study of the Armenian case and others, that one of the ways to destroy a group of people is to destroy their cultural heritage. And so when he was going into the Convention of Madrid, I think it was, presenting his case for new laws, new international laws, and to present what he was calling genocide, one of the main factors was what he called vandalism and barbarism. He saw that to destroy cultural heritage of a people is to separate them, to break them apart, to destroy their will, and eventually, erase them from a given land or from history. And so it was to his great disappointment in his writings. I'm getting this from that part of his definition was not included in the final definition of genocide. Nevertheless, his work exists, and other people maintain that the destruction of cultural heritage, because it was later, articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a human right. His early work is very important to establishing and continuing the importance of protecting cultural heritage.
And for our listeners, Rafael Lemkin was a Polish jurist who, during the interwar period between World War I and World War II, was engaged in the study that Mischa has been discussing, and was a critical, in fact, the critical scholar that led to the creation of the Genocide Convention. Now, I want to turn to another very important dimension of your book, which is this issue of microhistory. And one of the interesting issues I found in your argument is that the mass media has not been very attentive in addressing the significance of microhistories. So, first of all, can you explain to our audience what microhistories mean to you? And then, how should media professionals address these issues going forward, particularly dealing with human rights?
That is such a considered question. Thank you. Microhistories are hyper-local histories, accounts, records, documents, heritage that have been maintained by people who were often suppressed in some way, maybe due to war, due to occupation. And these microhistories are understood to be part and parcel to world history. Judicious reporting on complex regions, such as what we call the Middle East, requires at least some semblance of knowledge of those microhistories in order to provide enough context for reporting to make sense. Working that into the human rights framework means recognizing the intrinsic value of everyone involved. So, smaller ethnic groups are as important as majorities. If that is omitted from reporting, the reporting can come off as superficial or stenographic. And I'm just going to go back for a moment to what we touched on earlier, was the idea of content reporting versus impact reporting. There's a journalist from Paraguay named Yasmin Acuna, and she developed a framework that she calls change-centric journalism. It prioritizes journalism's job as writing the first draft of history and acting as watchdog by providing need-to-know information to the public. It's educational, it's guided by ethics and rights, and deeply considers the context and outcomes of reporting, both for the subjects and for the audience, and aims to be relational rather than transactional or just one-way communication by encouraging dialogue. This change-centric journalism framework or impact reporting, it can be more time-consuming because it requires some knowledge of history, which doesn't mean to say that journalists and reporters need to be historians to do their job, but it does require critical thinking and an awareness of the part of the world or the community on which they're reporting.
So, one of the things that I found very interesting in terms of your argument about why microhistories have been suppressed is the impact of colonialism. And you quote and cite one of the most significant scholars of that issue, and that's Edward Said. So, can you discuss how you feel this sort of long-term impact of colonialism has suppressed the microhistories, particularly of groups and cultures in what we call the Middle East?
That's a great question and such a deep, deep subject. And I think one that, as you said, it hasn't gone away. It keeps resurfacing. Edward Said wrote at length, as you know, and I'm sure your audience knows, about what he called Orientalism. He compared and contrasted the Occident and the Orient, using the word Orient and Orientalism to refer to what we now call the Middle East and places further east. And this was developed out of the colonialism, the imperialistic movements, where Western nations, the British, the Americans, were expanding into the East, and in essence, taking a very superior role, a very superior attitude towards those cultures. And that showed up in writings, in travel writings, in historical records, in the treatment of the imperialist to those being colonized. This was showing up in policies, in laws, in the colonies. It's basically Orientalism, this idea that the West is superior to the East, showed up in all aspects of life. In art, art is a huge field where Orientalism was featured. And we still see that today, I would say, in all of these avenues. And so it remains a framework for analysis.
If we look at that idea that Said brought up, that Orientalism became sort of a predominant cultural consciousness, and that influenced the media for media professionals who are educated in Western society and bringing that to their perspective to what we call the Middle East. How did that, in your view, set the stage for some of the cultural heritage destruction?
Well, if the heritage from the East is seen as less than, not as sophisticated, barbaric is a term that was frequently used in those days, then it had no value, or it had much lesser value, and so it's easier to destroy, and it's very easy to justify that destruction because it's devalued. And in a way, that links to the work of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. In their book, The Propaganda Model, they talk about victims who are worthy and unworthy. And particularly in that book, the focus was on the United States, and the client states or the allies of the United States are worthy. Those who are considered the enemies of those Western nations are unworthy. And so if life of a certain culture or part of the world is seen as inherently less valuable than Western lives, then it's just the justification is easy for destroying, for colonizing, for taking over, for killing.
So if we then think about all of these issues you've mentioned, we come to this difficult challenge in human rights education, which is to try to educate institutions about how they can become more aware of human rights and implement a framework about human rights when dealing with people they encounter or groups they deal with. So you have very extensive experience as a journalist, and you've also worked in human rights education. How should the media going forward become educated about human rights? Where do we go from here?
That's a tough one. Media professionals, in my opinion, would only benefit themselves and their audiences by becoming better educated on human rights. I mean, to our colleagues, certainly to you, to me, the fact that press freedom and the freedom of information are articulated rights in the Declaration of Human Rights would seem to make that a no-brainer for media, for journalism. However, that human rights are not widely taught presents such a catch-22. At Project Censored, the media watchdog and educational nonprofit where I work, we center human rights in all of our work, particularly Articles 19 and 26. Other media nonprofits, such as Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the Society for Professional Journalists, they do as well. Aside from keeping human rights front and center in all of the work that we do, I'm really not sure how to compel people to want to learn.
What about the nature of journalist education? For example, in schools of communication, schools of journalism, uh, what is the area there? What's the content there that might be altered in order to make this more prominent?
That's a huge question, and one that is frequently discussed. One thing that seems to be missing in current journalism programs, a lot of the J schools, even the really well-known, is history, the history of journalism. And
Mm.
that would behoove all of us to understand the history of journalism, to understand that, yes, First Amendment is hugely important in the United States, but that's not all. Article 19 and all of the articulated rights in the UN Declaration of Human Rights feed into, provide the backbone for our fourth estate. And yet, there are so many people coming out of journalism programs who've never heard this stuff. That if I had anything to do with changing academic programming, it would be to implement a deep history of journalism and the UN Declaration of Human Rights and what that means for
Well,
the
that's an
profession.
interesting, I think that's an interesting proposal because one of the things that, Human Rights Educators USA and other affiliated groups are trying to do is to raise the consciousness about the lack of information, about the lack of understanding. So efforts you make there and with Project Censored colleagues would be very helpful, I think.
Thank you. We certainly hope so. The organization is about to turn 50 next year, 50th anniversary, and it started out on a college campus. Started out on the campus of Sonoma State University in 1976 by a media scholar named Carl Jensen. It started as an educational forum and as a seminar, actually, and it has expanded into a nonprofit. And I mean, for us, the educational piece is as important as ever.
So I'd like you to go a little further into your work at Project Censored and the Censored Press, because my feeling is that many people have no knowledge that you exist, other than people in professional journalism, maybe in human rights. So, can you talk about how you take your interest in human rights and infuse it at Project Censored and in your work there?
Thank you. Yes, well, I'll tell you, I'm very lucky. I am very blessed because it's easy to infuse my human rights interest in the work because it is so central to that work. And I mean, like I said, Article 19 and Article 26, that's the right to, Article 19 is the right to a free press and the right to have access to information. Article 26, the right to education. Those two things are central to the work. And so it comes out in everything that we do. You know, I'll jump back for just a moment and share Project Censored's definition of censorship because that might help put this into more of a framework. As Project Censored defines censorship, it is the suppression of information, whether purposeful or not, by any method, including bias, omission, underreporting, or self-censorship, that prevents the public from fully knowing what is happening in society. So we're always looking at how and where this is happening and how to counter it. I'm sure your audience is well aware that press and academic freedoms are very much under attack right now. Also, human rights organizations, social justice organizations, environmental justice organizations, any nonprofit that can be considered quote unquote liberal can be targeted by the current administration as the enemy within and even, potentially as terrorists. While none of us want to invite the administration's wrath, we, the people, need to keep asserting our human and constitutional rights. And we at Project Censored, we are a nonprofit. So we're treading lightly. We're being smart. We're being cautious, but we are not capitulating. And so I think it's just very important that we keep doing the work that we do. Some of the ways that Project Censored deals with censorship and this pushback on press freedom and academic freedom is, I'm quoting our tagline now, by spotlighting the news that didn't make the news. And so we do it in a number of ways. Project Censored is now based at Ithaca College in New York and is partnered with the Park Center for Independent Media. Project Censored and the Park Center and Ithaca College hosts and participates in an array of academic and professional conferences and events. We have a well-established national campus affiliates program where we work with college campuses across the U.S. and freely share our curricula. It's available online for anybody. Project Censored has a weekly public affairs radio show that's aired from the Pacifica Network and across stations nationwide. I don't know what the current count is, at least 50 stations. It's also available on podcast platforms. The show is an hour-long conversation that features expert guests from all over who specialize in press and academic freedom. And our publishing imprint, as you mentioned, the Censored Press, publishes books, texts, and digital content focusing on these issues. So we take press freedom and the freedom to know and the freedom to be educated as human rights that are invaluable, and we're just doing all we can to share that.
Well, that's terrific, and I think it'd be valuable for all of our listeners to take a deep dive into your work and find out more.
Thank
Now,
you.
in your book, you have a chapter entitled, and I'm going to quote, "Silences That Bury the History of Armenian." Can you discuss the significance of this title and how it relates to the global problem of censorship, and not only by state actors, but by media outlets and other institutions?
Great question. And one that's not just about the Armenian case, obviously, but one that's very much on people's minds these days. With specific regard to the Armenians, going back to the genocide time, as we already touched on, there was a lot of reporting. And then after, half the Armenian population had been killed, all the news just stopped. And it just fell from public consciousness and really was not maintained in any way other than by people who care, by Armenians or people who were related. Fast forward to our technological age, this era of digital news and information and social media platforms, owing to big tech and corporate media alliances with political parties and governments and militaries, the internet and the media generally, or mass media generally, are far from the democratizing or corrective force that they were once purported to be. We have to, I mean, just looking around the United States, we see the problem of spreading news deserts, the evaporation of local news. One thing that's kind of pushing back against this is our college newspapers, college journalism, school newspapers, even high school newspapers that are filling in those gaps, those news deserts where, news has just become syndicated. So there is this problem. There's a problem with social media, the algorithms that prioritize what we see, what we don't see, what's deemed important, what isn't important. I don't think I'm really answering your question. I wish I had a better answer. I don't, other than to say, I think we have to keep searching and keep questioning. And even if someone is using their phone to get news, to understand that's being controlled algorithmically.
Mm. So, to go back to the specifics of the Armenian case, just to focus on one thing, we know, and you make it very clear in the book, and it's been documented very well, that the Turkish government, particularly since Ataturk, has systematically denied the genocide and also erased much Armenian cultural heritage. However, what's interesting to me, too, is that when the Soviet Union was established, a constituent SSR was the Armenian Socialist Republic. And I'm wondering what you think of how the experience in the Soviet Union was similar or different for Armenians in terms of cultural heritage than what existed in Turkey, for example.
Um, yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's a whole other aspect. And many people blame Stalin, and Stalin, of course, had much to do with the way the Soviet Union was established. So one part of the book focuses on an enclave that is situated within the nation of Azerbaijan. It's an ethnically Armenian enclave, or it was dissolved in 2023. But for all the years of the Soviet Union, Armenians lived they lived in Armenia, but then separate from Armenia, a neighboring country, Azerbaijan. Within that country, Azerbaijan is this enclave. And Stalin sort of gave that enclave to the Armenians, but kept the ethnic Armenians separate from the rest of Armenia proper. And so the Armenians in that enclave were surrounded by Azerbaijan, which was different ethnicity. The ethnic Azeris are related to the Turks. And so the Armenian cultural heritage there much of it has been destroyed by the Azerbaijani government in an attempt to posit that the Armenians are not indigenous, to say that this is Azeri territory only, it's an ethno-state. And it's been contentious for 40 odd years. There were wars. It wasn't even really a war. It was this Armenian enclave had been blockaded by the Azerbaijani government for almost 10 months. That ended in September 2023 with a lightning assault, a lightning military assault by the Azerbaijani government on the enclave. The Armenians who could gather themselves, more than 100,000 of them, fled to Armenia. There's one road that connects this enclave. In Armenian, it's called Artsakh. There's one road that was briefly opened, gave the Armenians, the ethnic Armenians of Artsakh, an opportunity to leave. They had just over 24 hours, and everybody who could fled. So this erasure is still underway. It's just happening differently.
Yeah, and I think this again comes back to the importance of understanding the complexity of these microhistories. And I think the important thing for our listeners too is that this exists right here in the United States. Let's talk about indigenous peoples in the United States. Let's talk about the current administration's effort, in my view, to erase a multiracial democracy by changing the narrative. And I think what you talked about in your book, and I want to make sure everybody understands the title or knows it, Media Framing and the Destruction of Cultural Heritage, News Narratives about Artsakh and Gaza. I think it's very significant that we take the ideas in your book and we extrapolate them too to other regions of the world. Because I'm sure you wrote the book not to simply talk about those two case studies, but to actually for the broader message. Can you just talk about that briefly?
You are spot on, 100%. Thank you. I could not agree more. When I was asked by the editors of Routledge's focus book series to write the text, I was asked to specifically focus on cultural heritage. And I mean, the first thing that came to mind is what's happening in this country. As you said, I mean, the First Nations, the native tribes, it's just abhorrent what's happening, and has been happening, obviously. I mean, I was so heartened when Leonard Peltier was released from prison, just to touch on what you touched on, the erasure of history. But I thought, I am not the person. I'm not Native American. I'm not the person to talk about that. So I used examples that I was more familiar with to discuss these issues, to discuss how cultural heritage is a human right, how cultural heritage is a tool for censorship, for erasure when it is destroyed, when it is targeted and destroyed by a government, and how it is used in the rewriting of history.
Yeah,
So
and I think what's interesting there too is that when you mention indigenous peoples in the United States or North America, one very important example is the importance of sacred land and efforts by the current administration to restrict access to sacred lands of Native peoples. These are perfect examples, I think, of your argument, wouldn't you say?
agree 100%. Yes.
So let me ask you at this point, there are these international organizations, NGOs, and other institutions that try to fight the destruction of cultural heritage. And as you discussed very clearly with Ostrak and the issues of Armenian enclaves. So what should human rights educators' role be in this effort, whether they're in the classroom and K through 12, university, or in other areas?
No, UNESCO, the international organization most noted for the protection and preservation of world heritage, has, in my opinion, of late, not lived up to its mission. We now have the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, who seem to be taking more of an interest in the protection of cultural heritage around the world. implementing this, I think it's in legal terms, a duty to protect regardless of national borders, the duty to protect cultural heritage. It takes political will, even among organizations that claim to be apolitical or nonpartisan. And in the United States at this time, with threats coming from the White House, with all that they're doing to change our museums and access to the sacred lands and history and civics, we the people still have power, and human rights educators or any educator have a very distinct role in sharing information with learners and prioritizing those issues. I'm reluctant to really try to prescribe any recommendation because I'm also aware that educators are under fire right now too, librarians. So as important as it is for us to keep getting these messages out, to sharing human rights, we're at such a weird time where it's not, our government is not welcoming this education.
Well, for example, would you agree or disagree that it would be important to include in the curriculum of, let's just say, pre-collegiate education, the examination of case studies of cultural heritage as a human right?
Absolutely. And I think, it's interesting that you asked that question now. A few years ago during the pandemic, I went back and got a graduate degree in education and media studies. And my thesis was on the intersections of, I'm kind of overstating it, but the intersections between critical media literacy and human rights education. And made a case, attempted to make a case for why human rights education should be part and parcel to curricula from, at all levels in the United States. And it was before I had taken this deeper dive into cultural heritage. But now, having done so much more research and done this book, I feel that, as you just said, using cultural heritage as an example could be a safer way, quote unquote safe, meaning because of these threats coming from our administration, could be a safer way of discussing human rights.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea because and just in the United States, for example, every state in the country has cultural heritage. Question is, how do you prioritize it and how do you view it in terms of essential rights? And I think a lot of people don't think of it that way, but part of our job might be to also raise that issue and raise the consciousness about it as a human right, as you've discussed in your book so very well. So let me turn to our last few questions. These are common for every interview, so I'm very interested to see what you're going to say. So who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights?
That's so hard. I can't pick just one. Aside from the famous historical figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, there's so many activists, artists, educators, journalists, whistleblowers who have affected my worldview and who I think are just so important to where we've come today. Bill, you yourself, Christy, Sandy, Felissa Tibbetts, the Brazilian educator who's passed on, Paulo Freire, Cornel West, Angela Davis. I could just list so many people. It's so hard for me to pick just one. Craig Mocheiber from the UN, who had the courage to step down Francesca Albanese at the UN, attorneys Amal Clooney, Leilani Farha, whistleblower who's passed on Daniel Ellsberg, Edward Snowden, journalist Ben Bagdikian, who had also worked with Daniel Ellsberg, or the organizer Chacha Jimenez. I mean, there's so many. I could keep going, but I'll stop here. Thank you
That's
for the
okay.
question.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a hard question. I know. So the second question, what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
Well, I have two. A favorite song from The Clash, Know Your Rights, song title, Joe Strummer, and attributed to the Black Panthers, All Power to the People.
Okay. And finally, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education for contemporary media, what would you advocate?
What we already touched on one, I would say teach the history of journalism in journalist programs and teach everyone, students and citizens alike, critical media literacy skills and human rights education.
I'd like to just take that a little bit further because the phrase critical media literacy, I think for some people is sort of amorphous. How do you define it?
To me, it's a line of inquiry. I'm gonna not articulate it as distinctly as Project Censored does because it's a cornerstone of the work. But just, in brief, it's a line of inquiry. It's looking at the power structures in media. It's looking at who, if you see a news clip on TV or on a video or read a story, to just take a moment and think about who wrote the story, who produced the story, who published the story, who edited the story, whose voice is being centered, who's left out. What are the priorities and how is that affecting the way I'm thinking about the information that I'm getting?
All good questions, I think, that need to be asked every time you read the newspaper.
Agreed. And I feel that just blends so well with human rights education because it's looking at power, it's looking at who has agency and who doesn't.
Right. Who's in the textbook and who isn't?
Mm-hmm. Who has value and worth and who doesn't.
Right. This has been a wonderful conversation, Mischa. I thank you very much for being with us, and I encourage everybody to read Media Framing and the Destruction of Cultural Heritage, a very powerful argument, I think, that is important for all human rights educators and listeners to encounter.
Bill, I am so grateful to have had this time with you. Thank you very much for your interest and support and for all that you do for human rights.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy, that's KRISTI, at HREUSA.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tina Hinz, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.